After 40 years of marriage, he left her for his 28-year-old secretary. But what he didn't know was that she owned everything he thought was his. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel to receive the best stories firsthand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The city of Crimson Falls was known for its towering corporate headquarters and ruthless business culture, and that morning, the glass towers reflected the autumn sun like golden daggers cutting through the crisp October air. Inside the 42nd floor of Sterling Industries' main building, Beatrice Harrington sat in her mahogany-paneled office, reviewing quarterly reports with the same meticulous attention she'd shown for the past 4 decades. At 62, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had built an empire from nothing, though few people knew the true extent of her power. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her navy Armani suit spoke of understated wealth rather than flashy displays. The walls of her office were lined with awards, not for her husband's achievements as most assumed, but for her own, though she had spent years allowing others to believe otherwise. The nameplate on her desk read, B. Harrington, Chief Financial Strategist, a title that barely scratched the surface of her actual role in the company. Outside her floor-to-ceiling windows, the bustling streets of the financial district hummed with activity. Crimson Falls had been their home for 38 years, ever since she and her husband Theodore had moved here as ambitious young professionals. She remembered those early days when they had dreamed together, planned together, built their future side by side. Theodore had been charming and driven, with the kind of magnetic personality that drew investors and clients like moths to a flame. But what those investors never knew was that behind every successful deal, every strategic decision, every financial triumph, was Beatrice's brilliant mind quietly orchestrating the moves. The irony wasn't lost on her that while Theodore basked in the spotlight as CEO of Sterling Industries, greeting clients with his trademark smile and commanding presence, the company's actual ownership structure told a very different story. 40 years ago, when Theodore had been nothing more than a junior executive with big dreams and bigger debts, it had been Beatrice's family inheritance, a substantial trust fund from her late father's textile empire, that had provided the initial capital. More importantly, it had been her shrewd legal maneuvering that had structured the company's ownership in a way that protected their assets while allowing Theodore to serve as the public face of their enterprise. The documents were locked away in her private safe. 73% ownership of Sterling Industries belonged to Harrington Holdings, a private investment firm registered under her maiden name. Theodore owned a mere 15%, with the remaining 12% distributed among key employees and board members she had handpicked over the years. For 4 decades, she had been content to let him play the role of the powerful CEO while she wielded the real authority from behind the scenes. Their marriage had been built on this partnership, this mutual understanding that they were stronger together than apart. Theodore brought the charisma and public relations skills, while Beatrice provided the financial acumen and strategic thinking that actually made their ventures profitable. It had worked beautifully for decades, until it didn't. The first cracks had appeared about 3 years ago when Theodore hired Amber Sinclair as his executive assistant. 28 years old, blonde, ambitious, and possessing the kind of beauty that turned heads in boardrooms, Amber had quickly become indispensable to Theodore's daily operations. At first, Beatrice had been pleased to see her husband working with such efficiency and enthusiasm. The long hours didn't bother her initially. After all, she herself often worked late into the evening, managing the complex financial instruments and investment portfolios that kept Sterling Industries at the top of the industry. But gradually, the late nights became secretive. The business trips that had once included her were suddenly too focused on operational details for her participation. Theodore began attending industry galas and networking events with Amber by his side, explaining to anyone who asked that Beatrice was too busy with her numbers to join them. The condescending tone when he referred to her work as playing with numbers should have been her first real warning. The revelation had come 6 months ago, in the most cliché way possible. Theodore's phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter while he showered, had buzzed with a text message from A.S. The preview was enough. Can't wait to be with you properly once you're free. I love you, darling. Beatrice had stared at those words for a full minute, 40 years of marriage crystallizing into that moment of betrayal. But Beatrice Harrington hadn't built a financial empire by acting impulsively. Instead of confronting Theodore immediately, she had done what she did best. She had planned, strategized, and prepared. Over the following months, she had quietly documented everything. The expensive gifts charged to company credit cards, the business trips to romantic destinations, the apartment Theodore had leased under the company name ostensibly for client meetings, but which she knew served as their love nest. More importantly, she had begun positioning herself for what she knew was coming. Key employees were discreetly made aware of her true role in the company. The board of directors, many of whom owed their positions to her recommendations, were subtly reminded of where their loyalties should lie. Financial safeguards were put in place, and legal documents were quietly updated to reflect the reality of the situation. Last night, Theodore had finally worked up the courage to ask for a divorce. He had chosen the setting carefully, their anniversary dinner at Chez Laurent, the same restaurant where he had proposed 41 years ago. As if the romantic setting might somehow soften the blow of his betrayal, he had spoken about growing apart and finding himself and pursuing happiness in his golden years. He had even had the audacity to suggest that he would be generous in the divorce settlement, offering her a comfortable monthly allowance and the house in Willowbrook Estates. What Theodore didn't know was that as of this morning, Beatrice had already set in motion the events that would show him exactly who held the real power in their relationship. Today was going to be the day that 40 years of carefully constructed illusions would come crashing down around the man who thought he could discard her like yesterday's newspaper. The intercom on her desk buzzed softly. "Mrs. Harrington," came the voice of her assistant Janet, "the board meeting is ready to begin, and Theodore has arrived. He's asking to speak with you privately before the meeting starts." Beatrice smiled slowly, an expression that held no warmth but promised justice. "Tell him I'll see him in the boardroom with everyone else. It's time for transparency in this company." She stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked toward the door. 40 years of playing the supportive wife in the shadows were about to end. Theodore wanted his freedom, and he was about to discover exactly what that freedom would cost him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mahogany doors of the Sterling Industries boardroom swung open as Beatrice entered with the measured confidence of someone who owned the building, which, as it happened, she did. The long conference table was surrounded by 12 leather chairs, 11 of which were occupied by the most powerful figures in Crimson Falls business community. At the head of the table sat Theodore, his silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable as always. To his immediate right, taking notes on a tablet with practiced efficiency, sat Amber Sinclair. Beatrice paused for just a moment, taking in the scene. Amber looked radiant in her coral pink dress, her blonde hair cascading over one shoulder as she leaned slightly toward Theodore, whispering something that made him smile. The intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone in the room, though most pretended not to notice. After all, Theodore Harrington was their CEO, and his personal life was his own business, or so they thought. "Good morning, everyone," Beatrice said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms for decades. She took her seat at the opposite end of the table from Theodore, a positioning that suddenly seemed less coincidental and more strategic than it had in previous meetings. Theodore cleared his throat, his confident CEO persona firmly in place. Beatrice, I was hoping we could have a private word before. Actually, Theodore, she interrupted smoothly, opening the leather portfolio she'd brought with her. I think everything we need to discuss should be shared with our board members. After all, transparency is so important in corporate governance, don't you think? A ripple of unease passed through the room. Board members exchanged glances, sensing an undercurrent they couldn't quite identify. Richard Clearwater, the longest-serving board member and one of Theodore's golf partners, leaned forward slightly. Perhaps we should address whatever personal matters need discussing in private and then proceed with the quarterly review. Beatrice's smile was perfectly polite and absolutely ruthless. Oh, but Richard, this isn't personal at all. This is entirely about the business. You see, there seems to be some confusion about the leadership structure of Sterling Industries, and I think it's time we cleared that up. Theodore's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. Beatrice, what are you doing? She ignored him, addressing the board directly. How many of you are aware of the actual ownership structure of this company? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Janet Morrison, the chief legal counsel and one of the few people in the room who knew exactly where this was heading, spoke up. Perhaps Mrs. Harrington could elaborate for those who might not have the complete picture. Certainly, Janet. Thank you. Beatrice stood, walking to the presentation screen at the far end of the room. With the remote control, she brought up a document that made Theodore's face go from pale to ashen. This is the ownership structure of Sterling Industries, as filed with the State Corporate Commission and updated as recently as last month. The pie chart on the screen was damning in its clarity. In bold letters, it showed Harrington Holdings LLC 73%, Theodore Harrington 15%, employee stock options 12%. Now, for those of you wondering about Harrington Holdings, Beatrice continued, her voice never wavering from its professional tone, that entity is owned entirely by me, under my maiden name, Beatrice Harrington Cross. It was established 40 years ago with capital from my family trust, and has served as the primary investor and owner of Sterling Industries since its inception. The silence in the room was deafening. Amber's pen had stopped moving across her tablet, her mouth slightly open as she stared at the screen. Theodore gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. That's impossible, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I built this company. I've been CEO for... You've been an excellent CEO, Theodore, Beatrice agreed, turning to face him directly. A position you've held at my discretion, as the majority owner. But CEO and owner are two very different things, as you're about to learn. Richard Clearwater found his voice first. Bea, I had no idea. We all assumed. You all assumed that because Theodore was the public face of the company, he must own it. A natural assumption, and one I was content to let stand. After all, we were partners in every sense of the word, we're being the operative phrase. The weight of that last sentence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Theodore's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time, and everyone could see it happening. You see, Beatrice continued, walking slowly around the table as she spoke, I've spent 40 years building this company while allowing my husband to take the credit. I structured the deals, managed the finances, made the strategic decisions that turned Sterling Industries into the powerhouse it is today. Theodore was the charming face who sold those decisions to clients and investors. She stopped directly behind Amber's chair. The young woman had gone rigid, finally understanding that she wasn't just caught in a marital dispute, she was trapped in a corporate power play she had never seen coming. But partnerships require trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. When those elements are compromised, Beatrice's eyes flicked meaningfully between Theodore and Amber. It becomes necessary to reassess the arrangement. Theodore found his voice, though it sounded nothing like the confident baritone that had commanded boardrooms for decades. Beatrice, you can't do this. We built this together, The clients, the relationships, the reputation are all assets of Sterling Industries, which I own, she finished calmly. The relationships were built on the company's success, not your personal charm. The clients trust the Sterling brand, not Theodore Harrington specifically. And the reputation? Well, that's about to become very interesting. She clicked the remote again, and a new document appeared on the screen. This one was a corporate resolution, already bearing several board member signatures. This is a resolution calling for new leadership at Sterling Industries, effective immediately. As the majority owner, I'm exercising my right to restructure the executive team. I'll be assuming the role of CEO, a position I'm uniquely qualified for, having actually run the company from behind the scenes for 4 decades. The room erupted in whispers and shuffled papers as board members tried to process what was happening. Theodore shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking completely. "You vindictive witch! You can't destroy everything I've worked for because you're jealous." "Jealous?" Beatrice's laugh was like cut crystal. "Theodore, I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply claiming what was always mine. The only thing being destroyed here is the illusion that you were ever in charge." She turned to address Amber directly for the first time. "Miss Sinclair, I'm sure you thought you were aligning yourself with a powerful, wealthy man. I don't blame you for that calculation. But I'm afraid your information was incomplete. The man you've been collaborating with has exactly 15% ownership in this company and a salary that I approve annually. His company credit cards, his expense account, his corner office, even his parking space, all of those are company assets that I control." Amber's face had gone from pink to white to green in the span of 30 seconds. The confident young woman who had waltzed into the boardroom thinking she was about to become the wife of a powerful CEO was realizing she had misjudged the situation catastrophically. Theodore slammed his hand down on the table. 40 years, Beatrice! 40 years of marriage, and you're going to throw it all away because you already threw it away, she said quietly, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade. You threw it away the moment you decided I was disposable. The moment you started planning your new life with your secretary, while assuming I would quietly fade into the background. The moment you offered me an allowance from my own money. The boardroom fell silent again, the weight of decades of deception and betrayal settling over everyone present. Theodore looked around the table, searching for allies, for someone who might challenge what was happening. But the signatures on that resolution told the story. The board had already chosen sides, and it wasn't his. "The vote will be formal, of course," Beatrice said, returning to her seat with the same composed dignity she'd entered with. "But I think we all know how it will go. After all, I didn't spend 40 years building this empire just to watch someone else give it away to their mistress." For the first time in 4 decades, Theodore Harrington was completely, utterly powerless. And as he looked across the table at the wife he had so casually discarded, he began to understand that his real punishment was just beginning. The formal vote was a massacre disguised as corporate procedure. One by one, each board member voiced their support for the leadership transition, their voices steady, but their eyes carefully avoiding Theodore's increasingly desperate gaze. Richard Clearwater, who had been Theodore's golf partner for 15 years, delivered his eye with the emotional detachment of a man reading stock prices. Janet Morrison's legal expertise lent weight to the proceedings as she confirmed that all documentation was in perfect order. Even Marcus Webb, the youngest board member whom Theodore had personally recruited just 2 years ago, cast his vote for change without hesitation. "Motion carries, 11-0, with 1 abstention," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying the authority that had always been hers but was now finally acknowledged. The abstention, of course, was Theodore himself, who sat frozen in his chair like a man watching his own execution. The boardroom began to empty as members filed out, each offering Beatrice congratulations that felt more like condolences for Theodore. The whispered conversations and meaningful glances spoke volumes about how quickly allegiances could shift when the true power structure was revealed. Within minutes, only 4 people remained: Beatrice, Theodore, Amber, and Janet Morrison, who lingered to handle the legal formalities. The transition documents will need to be filed with the state by end of business today, Janet said, addressing Beatrice while Theodore stared blankly at the mahogany table. I'll also need to update all banking authorizations, corporate credit accounts, and executive privileges. Theodore's head snapped up at the mention of banking. My accounts. You can't just freeze everything. I have personal expenses, commitments. Your personal accounts remain untouched, of course, Beatrice replied coolly. However, your corporate credit cards, expense accounts, and company car will be suspended immediately. Standard procedure during executive transitions. Amber shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. The coral pink dress that had seemed so confident and professional an hour ago now looked garish under the harsh boardroom lighting. What about my position? She asked quietly, her voice lacking its earlier brightness. Miss Sinclair, Beatrice turned to her with the same professional courtesy she might show any other employee. Your employment contract was with Sterling Industries, not with Theodore personally. That contract remains valid, though your duties will naturally change given the executive restructuring. The young woman's relief was palpable, though short-lived. Beatrice continued. However, I should mention that your new role will be in our accounting department, reporting to Janet. Your expertise in personal assistance won't be needed in the same capacity. The demotion was elegant in its cruelty. Amber would keep her job, her salary, her benefits, but she'd be buried in spreadsheets and audit reports, far from the executive floor and its proximity to power. The message was clear. Actions have consequences, even for those who thought they were simply following their hearts. Theodore finally found his voice, though it emerged as more of a croak. Beatrice, we need to talk, privately. This doesn't have to destroy everything. On the contrary, Theodore, I think we need witnesses for any further discussions. Transparency, remember? Beatrice's smile could have frozen hell itself. Besides, what could we possibly need to discuss privately? Your divorce attorney can handle the personal matters, and everything professional is now a matter of corporate record. The divorce, Theodore seized on the word like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. You don't have to do this, we can work something out. I made mistakes, yes, but we can fix this. Janet Morrison cleared her throat discreetly. I should mention that the company's legal department has already been contacted by Patterson, Williams & Associates regarding the dissolution of your marriage. They'll be representing Mrs. Harrington in those proceedings as well. Theodore's face went gray. Patterson, Williams & Associates was the most ruthless family law firm in Crimson Falls, known for their ability to financially eviscerate unfaithful spouses. They were expensive, thorough, and absolutely merciless. Exactly the kind of representation a woman with Beatrice's resources would retain. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Theodore said, his voice bitter with the taste of complete defeat. How long have you been planning this? Planning suggests I initiated this situation, Beatrice replied, standing and walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. I simply prepared for the inevitable. You made your choices, Theodore. I just made sure I was ready for the consequences. Amber spoke up hesitantly. Mrs. Harrington, I want you to know that I never intended. Miss Sinclair, Beatrice cut her off without turning around, I'm sure your intentions were quite clear. You saw an opportunity and took it. That's business sense, actually. Unfortunately for you, your market research was inadequate. The brutal dismissal hung in the air as Beatrice continued to gaze out at the city. From the 42nd floor, the people below looked like ants, scurrying about their daily lives without any awareness of the corporate drama unfolding above them. How many of those tiny figures down there thought they knew who Theodore Harrington was? How many business articles had praised his leadership, his vision, his success? How many networking events had he attended where people practically genuflected before the self-made CEO of Sterling Industries? The press release will go out this afternoon, Beatrice said, finally turning back to face the room. It will announce my assumption of the CEO role and thank Theodore for his years of dedicated service as a valued employee. The tone will be respectful, professional, and utterly final. Theodore shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking completely. Employee? I built this company. I brought in every major client we have. I created the relationships that made Sterling Industries what it is today. With my money, using my strategies, supported by my financial planning, Beatrice replied, her voice never rising above conversational level. You were an excellent salesman, Theodore. But salesmen are replaceable. Vision, capital, and strategic thinking are not. Janet began packing her documents, preparing to leave the room to these final moments of reckoning. As she reached the door, she paused. Mrs. Harrington, there is one more matter. The apartment lease on Riverside Drive, the one registered under company assets? Theodore's face flushed crimson. The apartment, their love nest, the place where he and Amber had played house while his wife of 40 years balanced the books that paid for it all. Terminate it immediately, Beatrice said without hesitation. Send the final month's rent and security deposit to Theodore's personal address. He can handle his personal housing arrangements on his own from now on. Amber made a small sound that might have been a whimper. The apartment had been her sanctuary, her proof that Theodore was serious about their relationship. Now it was just another corporate asset being liquidated. You can't do this to us, Theodore said, his voice breaking slightly. 40 years, Beatrice. Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore? For the first time since entering the boardroom, Beatrice's mask of professional composure slipped slightly, not into anger or hurt, but into something far more devastating, pity. 40 years meant everything to me, Theodore. That's why this hurts so much. Not because you left me. People fall out of love, marriages end, hearts change. I could have forgiven that. I could have forgiven an honest conversation about growing apart, about wanting different things in our golden years. She walked closer to him, close enough that he could see the pain behind her iron control. What I cannot and will not forgive is that you tried to steal from me. You offered me an allowance from my own money. You planned to keep the company, the house, the lifestyle I built, while discarding me like an obsolete employee. You didn't just break my heart, Theodore. You insulted my intelligence. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Amber seemed to understand that she was witnessing something beyond corporate maneuvering or marital discord. This was the reckoning of two people who had shared 4 decades of their lives, and only one of them had understood what they were really building together. Theodore sank back into his chair, the fight finally draining out of him. What happens now? Now you clean out your office. Security will escort you to ensure all company property is returned. Your personal items will be boxed and delivered to your new address once you provide it. Beatrice's voice had returned to its professional tone, but something had shifted. The conversation was over, the decision was final, and Theodore Harrington's reign as CEO of Sterling Industries was about to become just another chapter in someone else's success story. Janet will handle the logistics. Amber, please report to the accounting department first thing tomorrow morning. And Theodore? She paused at the door, not looking back. Try to remember that generosity works both ways. I'm not destroying you, I'm simply no longer building you up. The mahogany door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Theodore and Amber alone in the boardroom where his career had just ended and her dreams had just been revealed as costly illusions. The silence in Beatrice's office felt different now. Where once it had been the comfortable quiet of concentration, it now carried the weight of 40 years of carefully constructed lies finally crumbling into dust. She sat behind her mahogany desk, the same desk she'd occupied for 2 decades, while the world believed her husband ran the company from the larger office down the hall. The irony wasn't lost on her that Theodore's executive suite had always been more about appearance than function, a stage set for the performance of power, while the real work happened in her smaller, more practical space. The afternoon sun slanted through her windows, casting long shadows across the family photos that lined her credenza. There they were, frozen in silver frames, Theodore and Beatrice at their wedding, young and radiant with possibility. Vacation pictures from Tuscany, the Greek islands, Napa Valley, corporate events where they'd stood side by side, the perfect power couple of Crimson Falls society. Each image now felt like evidence of elaborate deception, though she wondered if she had been deceiving herself most of all. 41 years ago, Beatrice Cross had been 21 years old and fresh out of Wellesley, with a degree in economics and a trust fund that most people could only dream of. Her father, Harrison Cross, had built his textile empire through shrewd investments and an eye for emerging markets. He'd raised his only daughter to think like a businessman, to see opportunities where others saw risks, and to never apologize for being smarter than the men in the room. "Money is power, Beatrice," he'd told her on her 21st birthday as he'd signed over control of her inheritance. "But intelligence is what keeps that power from destroying you." She'd met Theodore Harrington at a charity gala in the spring of her senior year. He was 25, devastatingly handsome, and working as a junior associate at a mid-tier investment firm. What had attracted her wasn't his looks, though he was certainly attractive, but his ambition. Theodore had dreams that matched her own, visions of building something significant in the business world. When he'd talked about his plans for the future, his eyes had lit up with the kind of fire that she recognized in herself. Their courtship had been a meeting of minds as much as hearts. Theodore would pick her up from the library where she'd been researching market trends, and they'd spend hours discussing business strategies over coffee that grew cold as their conversations heated up. He'd respected her intelligence, sought out her opinions, and seemed genuinely fascinated by her understanding of financial markets. When he'd proposed on Christmas Eve of 1982, it had felt like the natural evolution of a partnership that was both romantic and professional. The early years of their marriage had been everything she'd dreamed they could be. They'd moved to Crimson Falls because Theodore had landed a position with Meridian Financial, one of the city's most respected investment firms. Beatrice had used a portion of her trust fund to purchase their first home, a modest colonial in the suburbs that would serve as their launching pad to bigger things. Theodore had thrown himself into his new job with characteristic enthusiasm, while Beatrice had begun quietly building her own investment portfolio using the knowledge her father had passed down to her. It was Beatrice who had first identified the opportunity that would become Sterling Industries. In 1984, she'd noticed that several manufacturing companies in the region were struggling with cash flow problems, despite having solid business models and strong customer bases. The issue wasn't demand. It was access to capital for equipment upgrades and expansion. Theodore's firm wasn't interested in what they considered small potatoes manufacturing loans, but Beatrice saw the potential. "What if we started our own investment company?" she'd suggested one evening, over dinner, spreading financial reports across their kitchen table like a general planning a campaign. "These businesses just need someone who understands their value proposition." Theodore had been skeptical at first. "Bea, honey, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but starting an investment firm requires serious capital. We're talking millions in startup costs, regulatory compliance, staff, office space." "I have the capital," she'd said simply, pulling out the trust fund documentation that showed her available assets. "And you have the client relationship skills. We could be partners, in every sense of the word." The look on Theodore's face when he'd seen the numbers had been a mixture of amazement and something else, something that should have been her first warning. It wasn't just love or gratitude she'd seen in his eyes, it was calculation. But in those early days, it had felt like a true partnership. They'd worked 18-hour days together, Theodore handling client presentations, while Beatrice analyzed deals and structured financing arrangements. She'd been the one to identify their first major success, a struggling automotive parts manufacturer that they'd helped retool for the emerging foreign car market. When that company had gone from near bankruptcy to record profits within 2 years, Sterling Industries had been launched into the big leagues. The problems had started so gradually that Beatrice had barely noticed them at first. It began with small things. Theodore would present deals to clients without mentioning that Beatrice had identified the opportunities. When business journalists wanted to write profiles of Sterling Industries, Theodore would handle the interviews alone, explaining that Beatrice was too busy with the technical side of things to speak with reporters. At industry conferences, he'd introduce her as my wife, Beatrice, who helps out with the numbers. As if the complex financial modeling and risk analysis that had made their success possible was some kind of hobby she'd picked up to keep busy. The shift had been so subtle that by the time Beatrice recognized what was happening, the narrative had already been established. Theodore Harrington was the visionary CEO who'd built Sterling Industries from nothing. Beatrice was the supportive wife who'd contributed some family money to get things started. The fact that she'd structured every major deal, identified every significant opportunity, and personally guaranteed the loans that had funded their early expansion had somehow been erased from the story. She'd tried to address it, of course. In 1987, after a particularly galling magazine article that had credited Theodore with single-handedly revolutionizing industrial financing in the region, she'd confronted him about the growing pattern. Theodore, we need to talk about how we're presenting the company to the media. These articles make it sound like I had nothing to do with building Sterling Industries. He'd looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading, his expression genuinely confused. Thea, honey, you know how important you are to everything we do. But you have to understand, these reporters want to write about personalities, not financial structures. They want the human interest story, the charismatic leader. That's just not your style. Not my style? The comment had stung more than she'd expected. Theodore, I identified the market opportunity. I provided the capital. I structured the deals that made our reputation. And you did a wonderful job with all of that, he'd said patronizingly, reaching over to pat her hand. But running a company is about more than just the technical stuff. It's about relationships, public perception, building trust with clients. That's where I add value. The condescension in his tone had been unmistakable, but she'd told herself it was just miscommunication. Theodore didn't mean to diminish her contributions. He was simply better at public speaking, more comfortable with reporters and clients. It made sense for him to be the public face of their company. Except it hadn't stopped with public relations. Gradually, Theodore had begun making unilateral decisions about company direction without consulting her. When she'd questioned him about a risky acquisition he'd approved without her input, he'd dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. Beatrice, I know you're brilliant with numbers, but sometimes you overthink things. This deal is about relationships and market positioning. Trust me on this one. The acquisition had been a disaster, costing Sterling Industries nearly $2 million and taking 3 years to recover from. But somehow, in the retelling, it had become, quote, a valuable learning experience that taught us important lessons about market timing. By the early 1990s, the pattern had been firmly established. Theodore made the public decisions and took the public credit. Beatrice handled the actual business operations and financial strategy from behind the scenes. When their success was celebrated at industry events, Theodore stood at podiums accepting awards while Beatrice sat at tables in the audience, applauding her husband's recognition for work she'd largely done herself. The worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. She'd never been motivated by public acclaim. The worst part was watching the man she'd loved and trusted slowly transform into someone who genuinely believed his own mythology. By the time Theodore began referring to Sterling Industries as his company, even in private conversations, Beatrice realized that he'd forgotten it had ever been any other way. She'd stayed silent, telling herself that their marriage was more important than professional recognition. She'd convinced herself that their partnership was what mattered, not who got the credit. And for 20 years, she'd maintained that illusion, even as Theodore grew more distant, more condescending, and more convinced of his own indispensability. The trust fund that had launched their empire had been gradually absorbed into company operations, documented as loans and capital investments that Theodore had signed for but never truly understood. The legal structures that protected their assets had all been designed by Beatrice, though Theodore had signed the documents with barely a glance at their contents. For 4 decades, she'd been the invisible architect of their success, while he'd played the role of the brilliant CEO for an audience that never knew the difference. Until Amber Sinclair had arrived with her youth, her ambition, and her willingness to believe that Theodore Harrington was exactly as powerful as he pretended to be. And Theodore, seduced by the opportunity to finally become the man everyone thought he was, had made the fatal mistake of believing he could discard the woman who'd made it all possible. Now, sitting in her office as the sun set over Crimson Falls, Beatrice finally understood that she'd spent 40 years enabling her own marginalization. But that understanding came with a price, the knowledge that the man she'd loved had never really existed at all. The news of Theodore Harrington's sudden departure from Sterling Industries spread through Crimson Falls' business community like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest. By 5 o'clock that evening, Beatrice's phone had been ringing non-stop, with calls from reporters, business partners, and curious socialites, all desperate to understand what had really happened in that boardroom. She'd instructed her assistant to refer all media inquiries to the company's public relations department, but the personal calls were harder to deflect. "Beatrice, darling, what on earth is going on?" The voice belonged to Patricia Drummond, the wife of one of Sterling Industries' biggest clients, and the unofficial queen of Crimson Falls society. "Harold just came home from the club saying Theodore's been forced out of his own company. Surely that can't be true." "Patricia, I appreciate your concern, but this is simply a routine corporate restructuring," Beatrice replied, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd spent decades deflecting uncomfortable questions. "Theodore remains a valued stakeholder in Sterling Industries, and I'm confident the transition will be smooth for all of our clients." "But the rumors, Beatrice. People are saying you actually own the company. That Theodore never really—" "The ownership structure of Sterling Industries has been properly documented with the state for 40 years, Patricia. If people are just learning about it now, that says more about their assumptions than it does about our business practices." The subtle rebuke hung in the air for a moment before Patricia's tone shifted to something approaching awe. "My God, Beatrice, you mean it's true? You've been the real power behind Sterling Industries this entire time?" "I prefer to think of it as the power within Sterling Industries, Patricia. But yes, the documentation is quite clear on the matter." After ending the call, Beatrice realized that Patricia Drummond's reaction would be replicated dozens of times over the next few days. The revelation that Crimson Falls' most prominent CEO had actually been a well-paid employee would send shockwaves through the city's social hierarchy. Dinner party guest lists would be quietly revised, country club invitations reconsidered, and charity board positions suddenly reevaluated. Theodore's social currency had been built on the assumption of his corporate power, and without that foundation, his value in their elite circles would evaporate overnight. But it was the business implications that truly mattered. Within hours of the press release announcing Beatrice's assumption of the CEO role, her calendar had filled with requests for meetings from clients who suddenly wanted to reassure themselves that their accounts were secure. She'd spent the remainder of the afternoon in back-to-back video conferences with Sterling Industries' most important customers, explaining the transition and subtly demonstrating that she knew far more about their accounts than Theodore ever had. "Mrs. Harrington," said James Morrison, CEO of Pinnacle Manufacturing and one of Sterling's oldest clients, "I have to admit I'm surprised by today's developments. Theodore never mentioned that you were so deeply involved in the day-to-day operations." "Mr. Morrison, I've been personally managing your company's financing arrangements for 12 years. Every restructuring proposal, every expansion loan, Every risk assessment that Sterling Industries has provided to Pinnacle has crossed my desk first. Theodore may have presented those recommendations, but they originated from my analysis of your business needs." The silence on the other end of the video call was telling. Morrison was clearly processing the fact that every strategic financial decision his company had made over the past decade had been guided by a woman he'd barely acknowledged at corporate events. I had no idea. Theodore always made it seem like the recommendations came from him. Yes, I'm aware of that perception, but I can assure you that the quality of Sterling's services to Pinnacle won't change simply because you now know who's actually been providing them. By the time she'd finished her last client call at 8 o'clock that evening, Beatrice felt emotionally drained but professionally vindicated. Client after client had expressed surprise at learning about her role, but not one had threatened to take their business elsewhere. If anything, several had seemed impressed to discover that their accounts had been managed by someone with her credentials and experience. The real test, however, came the following morning when she arrived at Sterling Industries to find a small crowd of reporters gathered outside the building's main entrance. She'd expected media attention, but the sheer number of news vans suggested that the story had legs beyond simple business reporting. "Mrs. Harrington! Mrs. Harrington!" The voices called out as she approached the building, flanked by security guards who'd been waiting for her arrival. "Can you comment on the allegations that your husband was having an affair with his secretary? Is it true that you've been the real owner of Sterling Industries for 40 years? What message does this send to other women in corporate America?" Beatrice paused at the building's entrance, her hand on the glass door. She could have walked inside without comment. Let the story die down through careful silence and professional dignity. But something about that last question, about the message this sent to other women, made her turn to face the cameras. "I'll make one statement, and then I need to get to work running my company," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. The reporters fell silent, sensing that they were about to get something significant. "For 40 years, I have been the majority owner and primary financial strategist of Sterling Industries. During that time, I allowed my former husband to serve as the public face of the company while I focused on the actual business operations. This arrangement worked well when we shared common goals and mutual respect." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "However, when personal betrayals began to compromise professional judgment, it became necessary to clarify the actual leadership structure of this company. Sterling Industries was built with my capital, through my strategic vision, and with my direct involvement in every major business decision. These are not recent developments. They are simply facts that are now being publicly acknowledged." A reporter from the Crimson Falls Business Journal pushed forward. "Mrs. Harrington, are you saying that Theodore Harrington deliberately misrepresented his role in the company?" "I'm saying that Theodore Harrington performed the role he was given very well for many years. Public relations, client entertainment, and corporate representation are valuable skills. But ownership, strategic planning, and financial management are different skill sets entirely. It's unfortunate that it took a personal crisis to make that distinction clear." "What about the affair allegations?" called out a reporter from the city's tabloid newspaper. Beatrice's smile could have frozen the morning coffee in their hands. "My former husband's personal choices are between him and his conscience. My concern is protecting the interests of Sterling Industries' employees, clients, and shareholders. That's what CEOs do." As she turned to enter the building, one final question followed her. "Mrs. Harrington, do you think Theodore Harrington will try to fight this transition?" Without turning back, she replied, "With what army? And more importantly, with whose money?" The lobby of Sterling Industries felt different as she walked toward the elevators. Employees who had barely acknowledged her presence for years now watched her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. The security guard at the front desk, a man who'd worked there for 15 years, actually stood up as she passed. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington," he said, his tone carrying a deference that had never been there before. "Congratulations on the promotion, ma'am." Thank you, Robert. Though I should mention, it's not really a promotion, more like coming out of the shadows. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor gave her a moment to process what had just happened. In the span of 24 hours, she'd gone from being Theodore Harrington's wife to being Beatrice Harrington, CEO. The transformation felt both sudden and long overdue, like a butterfly finally emerging from a cocoon that had grown too small decades ago. When the elevator doors opened, she was surprised to find Janet Morrison waiting for her with a stack of documents and an expression that mixed professional concern with personal satisfaction. "Mrs. Harrington, we need to discuss Theodore's response to yesterday's developments. His attorney called this morning with some interesting proposals." "Oh?" Beatrice raised an eyebrow as she walked toward her office, which would now need to be relocated to the larger executive suite that Theodore had vacated. "What kind of proposals?" "He's claiming that the ownership documents were forged, that you coerced the board into voting against him, and that he intends to file lawsuits for wrongful termination, defamation, and corporate theft." Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face Janet, her expression shifting from curious to something far more dangerous. "He's claiming I forged documents that have been on file with the state for 40 years? That's what his attorney is threatening. They're also suggesting that your assumption of the CEO role constitutes a hostile corporate takeover, and that Theodore's shareholders' rights have been violated." For a moment, Beatrice felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: genuine anger. Not the cold fury of betrayal or the calculated rage of strategic planning, but the hot, immediate anger of someone whose intelligence had been insulted beyond endurance. "Janet, please schedule a press conference for this afternoon and contact our litigation department. I think it's time Mr. Theodore Harrington learned the difference between what he thought he owned and what he actually signed away." The gloves, as they say, were officially off. The press conference that afternoon was held in the Sterling Industries main conference room, the same space where quarterly earnings calls had been conducted for decades, with Theodore at the head of the table fielding questions from financial analysts. Now, as Beatrice took her place behind the podium bearing the company logo, the irony wasn't lost on anyone present that she was finally occupying the position she'd intellectually held for 40 years. The room was packed beyond capacity. Representatives from every major business publication in the region had shown up, along with local television news crews and even a few national financial reporters who'd caught wind of what was being whispered about as the corporate story of the year. In the back of the room, Beatrice noticed several familiar faces from Crimson Fall's business community, competitors, clients, and former colleagues who'd come to witness what they suspected might be a spectacular corporate implosion. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," Beatrice began, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from decades of boardroom presentations, even if most of the world had never seen them. "I'm here to address the questions that have arisen regarding the leadership transition at Sterling Industries and to set the record straight about certain claims that have been made by my former husband's legal representatives." She gestured to Janet Morrison, who activated the large display screen behind the podium. The first document that appeared was a corporate filing dated 1984, bearing official state seals and signatures. "This is the original incorporation document for Sterling Industries, filed with the State Department of Corporate Affairs on March 15, 1984. As you can see, the company was established by Harrington Holdings LLC with an initial capital investment of $2.7 million. The managing member of Harrington Holdings, as clearly stated in these documents, is Beatrice Cross Harrington." A murmur rippled through the room as reporters leaned forward to get a better look at the screen. Several were already typing furiously on their laptops and tablets. "The next document," Beatrice continued as Janet advanced to the next slide, "is the company's most recent annual report, filed just 3 months ago. As you can see, the ownership structure has remained consistent for 40 years. Harrington Holdings maintains a 73% controlling interest in Sterling Industries." A reporter from the Financial Times raised her hand. Mrs. Harrington, if you've been the majority owner for 4 decades, why are we only learning about this now? That's an excellent question, Beatrice replied, her tone carrying just a hint of dry humor. I suppose the answer is that very few people bothered to look at the actual corporate filings. They simply assumed that because Theodore served as CEO and was the public face of the company, he must also be the owner. It's a natural assumption, but as we can see, it was incorrect. Are you saying that Theodore Harrington deliberately misled people about his ownership stake? This question came from a reporter with the Crimson Falls Business Journal, his pen poised over his notepad. I'm saying that Theodore Harrington allowed people to believe what was convenient for him to have them believe. Whether that constitutes deliberate misleading or simply selective transparency, I'll leave for others to judge. Janet advanced to the next slide, which showed a series of loan documents and financial agreements spanning 4 decades. These documents represent the financial foundation upon which Sterling Industries was built. Every major expansion, every acquisition, every significant business decision was funded through Harrington Holdings' credit lines and capital reserves. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. One reporter, clearly doing math in his head, raised his hand tentatively. Mrs. Harrington, are you saying that Theodore Harrington never actually invested his own money in Sterling Industries? I'm saying that Theodore Harrington's total personal investment in Sterling Industries, as documented in these filings, amounts to approximately $50,000 over 40 years. For context, that's less than we spend annually on office supplies. The silence that followed was deafening. In the back of the room, several business leaders who had spent decades treating Theodore as a peer, inviting him to exclusive deals, seeking his partnership on major ventures, were clearly recalculating everything they thought they knew about Crimson Falls' business hierarchy. Mrs. Harrington, called out a reporter from Channel 7 News, Theodore Harrington's attorney issued a statement this morning claiming that you forged these ownership documents and that you've essentially staged a corporate coup. How do you respond to those accusations? Beatrice's smile was razor-sharp. I respond by inviting Mr. Harrington's attorney to examine the public records that have been on file with the state for 4 decades. I also invite him to explain how I could have forged documents that were notarized, witnessed, and filed by multiple independent law firms over the course of 40 years. Unless he's suggesting I've been running a decades-long conspiracy involving state regulatory agencies, multiple law firms, accounting companies, and banks. His claims are, let's say they're creative. What about his claim of wrongful termination? This from a reporter whose press badge identified him as being from a legal affairs publication. Theodore Harrington was not terminated. He was removed from his position as CEO by a unanimous vote of the board of directors, as is their right under the company's bylaws. He remains a shareholder and will continue to receive distributions based on his 15% ownership stake, assuming the company remains profitable, which, given that I've been making the actual business decisions for 40 years, seems likely. Janet advanced to a new slide that showed Sterling Industries' financial performance over the past decade. The charts displayed consistent growth in revenue, profit margins, and client retention. These performance metrics represent the company that Theodore is claiming was built through his vision and leadership. I would argue that they actually represent the company that was built through careful financial planning, strategic risk management, and disciplined operational oversight, functions that have been my responsibility throughout Sterling Industries' existence. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal raised her hand. Mrs. Harrington, this situation raises broader questions about corporate transparency and gender dynamics in business leadership. Do you see your situation as representative of a larger pattern in American business? Beatrice paused, considering the question carefully. I think my situation is representative of what happens when intelligent women choose to work behind the scenes rather than demanding public recognition for their contributions. For 40 years, I prioritized the success of our company and our marriage over personal acclaim. That was my choice, and I don't regret it. What I do regret is that it took a personal betrayal to make me realize that my contributions deserved acknowledgement, not just from the public, but from my husband. Can you elaborate on the personal betrayal you mentioned? The question came from a reporter whose tabloid credentials suggested he was more interested in scandal than business analysis. I can elaborate by saying that when someone spends decades building something with a partner, they expect that partner to respect both their contributions and their relationship. When that respect is absent, business decisions become necessary to protect one's interests. That's all I'm prepared to say about personal matters. Another reporter jumped in quickly. Mrs. Harrington, what's your response to rumors that Theodore Harrington was having an affair with his secretary? My response is that Theodore Harrington's personal conduct is between him and his conscience. My concern is protecting the interests of Sterling Industries and ensuring that our clients continue to receive the highest level of service. Personal drama has no place in professional decision-making. But surely the affair allegations influenced your decision to remove him as CEO? Beatrice's expression hardened slightly. The decision to restructure Sterling Industries' leadership was based entirely on what was best for the company and its stakeholders. The fact that personal misconduct may have compromised Theodore's judgment and professional relationships was certainly a factor in that assessment. But let me be clear. If Theodore had been a model husband but an incompetent CEO, the result would have been the same. And if he had been unfaithful but brilliant at his job, we would have found a way to separate personal issues from professional responsibilities. She paused, letting that statement sink in before delivering the final blow. The problem is that Theodore was neither a model husband nor the brilliant CEO that everyone believed him to be. He was a moderately competent spokesperson for a company that succeeded despite his limitations, not because of his contributions. The affair didn't create his professional inadequacies, it simply revealed them. The room erupted in a flurry of raised hands and shouted questions, but Beatrice raised her own hand for silence. That concludes this press conference. Sterling Industries will continue to operate as we have for 40 years, profitably, ethically, and with a focus on delivering value to our clients. The only thing that's changed is that we're no longer pretending about who's actually been running the company all along. As she walked away from the podium, Beatrice could hear the reporters frantically calling out follow-up questions, but she didn't look back. The truth was finally out there for everyone to see. And Theodore Harrington's reputation was about to become collateral damage in a war he had started but could never win. Theodore sat in the cramped studio apartment above Murphy's Deli on 5th Street, staring at the laptop screen that displayed the live stream of his wife's press conference. The apartment belonged to his nephew Kevin, a struggling artist who'd reluctantly agreed to let his uncle crash on the couch after Theodore had been unceremoniously escorted from his office the day before. The contrast between this shabby space, with its peeling wallpaper and the persistent smell of pastrami from the deli below, and the penthouse suite at Willowbrook Towers, where he'd lived for the past 15 years, was jarring enough to make him question if this was all some elaborate nightmare. But watching Beatrice systematically dismantle his entire professional identity on live television confirmed that this was brutally, devastatingly real. The problem is that Theodore was neither a model husband nor the brilliant CEO that everyone believed him to be. Her words echoed in the small room as Theodore closed the laptop with shaking hands. 40 years of his life had just been reduced to a single damning assessment. Moderately competent spokesperson for a company that succeeded despite his limitations. The woman he'd dismissed as his number-crunching wife had just revealed to the entire business world that he'd been nothing more than a well-dressed fraud. Kevin emerged from the kitchenette with 2 cups of instant coffee, his paint-stained apron still tied around his waist. At 28, he bore a strong resemblance to Theodore at that age, but his eyes held a wariness that suggested he'd been following the family drama in the news. Uncle Ted, I caught some of that press conference on the radio downstairs. That was intense. Theodore accepted the coffee without looking up. She destroyed me, Kevin. In front of everyone who matters in this city, she made me look like a complete fool. But Uncle Ted, if what she said is true about the ownership documents— Of course it's true, Theodore snapped, then immediately felt guilty for taking his frustration out on the one person who'd been willing to help him. I'm sorry, Kevin. It's just, I never thought about the paperwork. Beatrice always handled that stuff. I focused on the client relationships, the public appearances, the big picture strategy. Kevin sat down in the threadbare armchair across from the couch, studying his uncle with the kind of analytical gaze that Theodore remembered from Kevin's childhood. The boy had always been perceptive, perhaps too much so. Uncle Ted, can I ask you something? Did you really not know that Aunt Bee owned the company? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Theodore opened his mouth to give an automatic denial, then stopped. Kevin deserved honesty, even if Theodore wasn't sure he could handle the truth himself. I knew she put up the initial money, he said slowly, staring into his coffee cup. Her father's trust fund gave us the capital to get started. But that was just seed money, you know? I thought once we started making profits, once we built the business up, it became ours, our company, our success. But the legal documents, I never read them, Kevin. Not really. Beatrice would put a stack of papers in front of me, explain what they were for, and I'd sign them. She was brilliant with that stuff, better than any lawyer we could have hired. I trusted her completely. Kevin was quiet for a moment, then asked gently, when did you stop trusting her? The question hit Theodore like a physical blow. When had he stopped trusting Beatrice? When had he started seeing her contributions as somehow less valuable than his own? He tried to remember the exact moment when our company had become my company in his mind, but it had been such a gradual shift that pinpointing it felt impossible. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe when the press started writing articles about me, when industry groups started giving me awards, when clients would specifically ask to meet with me instead of the wife. It felt like validation, you know? Like proof that I was actually good at this. But Aunt Bee was doing all the actual work behind the scenes? Theodore nodded miserably. She'd identify the opportunities, structure the deals, run the risk analyses. I'd polish her recommendations and present them to clients. But somewhere along the way, I started believing that the presentation was the hard part, that anyone could crunch numbers, but it took real skill to sell the vision. Kevin leaned forward, his expression serious. Uncle Ted, that's not how business works. The analysis is everything. The presentation is just performance. The brutal simplicity of his nephew's assessment made Theodore's stomach clench. He'd spent decades thinking of himself as the visionary, while dismissing Beatrice as the detail-oriented support staff. But if Kevin was right, if the analysis was everything, and the presentation was just performance, then Theodore had been nothing more than an actor playing a role that Beatrice had written for him. His phone buzzed with a text message, and Theodore's heart jumped, hoping it might be Beatrice offering some kind of olive branch. Instead, it was from his attorney, Marcus Webb, who'd been calling nonstop since the press conference ended. Quote, Ted, we need to talk. The forgery angle isn't going to work. The documents are legitimate and have been on file for 40 years. We need to explore other options. Call me. Other options. What other options were there when your entire professional identity had been built on a foundation you'd never bothered to examine? Theodore thought about the phone calls he'd been receiving all morning from colleagues and clients, calls he'd been too ashamed to answer. He thought about the board members who'd voted unanimously to remove him, people he'd considered friends and allies for decades. He thought about Amber, who'd been calling and texting desperately since yesterday, trying to understand how the powerful CEO she'd fallen for had suddenly become an unemployed middle manager. Kevin, Theodore said quietly, I think I've been lying to myself for a very long time. His nephew nodded. About Aunt Bea? About everything. about what I contributed to the company, about what I deserved, about who I actually was versus who I wanted to be. Theodore set down his coffee cup and ran his hands through his hair. You know what the worst part is? I convinced myself that Beatrice was lucky to have me, that she needed me to be successful, that without my charm and my client relationships, she'd just be another smart woman with money but no idea how to use it. And now? Now I realize that every successful deal, every major client, every strategic decision that built Sterling Industries came from her mind. The clients weren't loyal to me. They were loyal to the results she delivered. The awards I won were for her work. The reputation I built was based on her success. Theodore's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID, Patricia Drummond, one of Crimson Fall's most influential socialites, and someone whose dinner parties had been a staple of Theodore's networking strategy for years. He let it go to voicemail, knowing that Patricia wasn't calling to offer support. She's probably calling to disinvite me from her charity gala next month, Theodore said with bitter humor. Can't have a disgraced former fake CEO at the head table. Kevin studied his uncle with the kind of intense focus that made Theodore remember why he'd always been slightly intimidated by this particular nephew. Uncle Ted, what are you going to do now? It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of existential crisis. What do you do when you discover that your entire adult identity has been a carefully maintained illusion? How do you rebuild when the foundation of your self-worth has been revealed as someone else's generosity? I don't know, Theodore admitted. For 40 years, I've been Theodore Harrington, CEO of Sterling Industries. I don't know who Theodore Harrington is without that title. Maybe that's what you need to figure out. Theodore looked at his nephew, this 28-year-old artist who worked part-time at a coffee shop and lived above a deli, but who somehow seemed to have a clearer understanding of reality than Theodore had managed in 4 decades of supposed business success. Kevin, can I ask you something? When you look at me now, after everything that's come out, what do you see? Kevin was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. I see someone who got caught up in a story about himself and forgot to check if it was true. But I also see someone who's smart enough to have fooled a lot of people for a long time, even if he was fooling himself most of all. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you realize that if you could play the role of a successful CEO for 40 years, maybe you have some actual abilities you've never had to use. Maybe now you'll find out what you're really capable of when you can't coast on someone else's work. As Theodore sat in that cramped apartment, surrounded by the debris of his shattered self-image, he began to understand that Kevin might be right. For the first time in decades, he was going to have to discover who he actually was when stripped of titles, corner offices, and the protective shield of Beatrice's quiet competence. The question was whether he had the courage to face what he might find. 3 weeks had passed since the press conference that had effectively ended Theodore's career, and he had spent most of that time in a haze of self-recrimination and whiskey. But on this particular morning, something shifted. Maybe it was Kevin's words about discovering his real abilities, or maybe it was simply that he'd hit rock bottom so hard that the only direction left was up. Whatever the catalyst, Theodore found himself standing outside the headquarters of Sterling Industries at 6:30 in the morning, wearing his best remaining suit and carrying a manila folder that represented his first genuine attempt at professional redemption. The security guard at the front desk, Robert, who had worked there for 15 years, looked up in surprise when Theodore approached. There was an awkward moment of recognition, followed by the kind of uncomfortable silence that had become Theodore's constant companion over the past 3 weeks. Mr. Harrington, Robert said carefully, his tone neutral but not unkind, I'm sorry, but your building access was revoked as part of the transition. I can't let you upstairs without authorization. I understand, Robert. Could you please call Mrs. Harrington's office and tell her that I'd like to request a meeting? I have something I think she should see. Robert's eyebrows rose slightly, but he picked up the phone and made the call. After a brief conversation, he hung up and looked at Theodore with what might have been sympathy. Mrs. Harrington says she can see you at 7 o'clock. She'll meet you in Conference Room B on the 3rd floor. I can escort you there. Conference Room B was a small utilitarian space typically used for minor departmental meetings, a far cry from the executive boardroom where Theodore had held court for so many years. The symbolism wasn't lost on him as he sat at the simple table, waiting for the woman who had once been his wife and was now, effectively, his judge. Beatrice entered at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying her ever-present leather portfolio and wearing a charcoal gray suit that spoke of understated authority. She looked well, better than well, actually. The past 3 weeks of finally operating in her rightful role as CEO seemed to have given her a vitality that Theodore didn't remember seeing in years. "Theodore," she said, taking a seat across from him with the kind of careful distance that suggested this was a business meeting, nothing more. "Robert said you had something you wanted to show me." "I do." Theodore opened his manila folder and spread out several sheets of paper across the table. "I've been doing some research over the past few weeks. About Sterling Industries, about our clients, about everything I should have been paying attention to for the past 40 years. Beatrice glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "And what did you discover?" "I discovered that you were right, about all of it." Theodore's voice was steady, but Beatrice could hear the effort it took to maintain that composure. "I spent 3 weeks going through every major deal Sterling Industries has done since 1985. Every acquisition, every strategic partnership, every expansion into new markets. And in every single case, the original opportunity identification came from you." He pointed to the first sheet of paper, which contained a detailed timeline. "The Meridian Manufacturing deal in 1987, the one that really put us on the map? I remember presenting that to the board as my strategic vision for expanding into industrial lending. But I found your original analysis in the company files. You'd identified that opportunity 18 months before I ever heard of Meridian." Beatrice's expression remained neutral, but Theodore caught a flicker of something that might have been surprise. "The Hamilton Group acquisition in 1994, Theodore continued, moving to the next document. "I gave interviews to 3 different business magazines about my innovative approach to vertical integration. But your preliminary research showed that Hamilton was undervalued by 30% due to temporary cash flow issues, not fundamental business problems. You laid out the entire acquisition strategy 6 months before I announced it as my idea. Theodore, what's the point of this exercise?" Beatrice's voice carried a note of impatience, but she hadn't left the room. "The point is that I want to understand exactly how deep my self-deception went. And I want you to know that I understand it now." Theodore pulled out another sheet of paper, this one covered with his own handwriting. "I made a list of every major business decision I thought I had made over the past 40 years. Then I went through the company files and found the real source of each decision. Every single one traced back to your analysis, your research, your strategic thinking." He looked up at Beatrice, and for the first time in weeks his eyes held something other than shame or self-pity. "I've been taking credit for your genius for 4 decades, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. And now that you do realize it, what exactly do you want from me?" Beatrice's tone was carefully controlled, giving nothing away. "I want to make amends," Theodore said simply, "not for the marriage. I know I destroyed that beyond repair, but for the business, for taking credit that wasn't mine, for letting the world believe that Sterling Industries succeeded because of my vision when it was really your brilliance that built everything." Beatrice leaned back in her chair, studying Theodore with the kind of analytical gaze he remembered from their early years together, when she would evaluate potential investments with the same systematic thoroughness. "How exactly do you propose to make amends for 40 years of intellectual theft?" The bluntness of her phrasing made Theodore flinch, but he pressed on. "I've written a detailed confession, a complete account of the real decision-making process behind every major success Sterling Industries has had. I want to give it to the business press. I want to set the record straight about who really built this company." A confession? Beatrice's eyebrows rose slightly. Theodore, that would completely destroy whatever remains of your professional reputation. My professional reputation was built on a lie. Maybe it's time for the truth. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming silently on the table as she considered his proposal. Why now, Theodore? 3 weeks ago, you were threatening to sue me for corporate theft. Now you want to publicly admit that you were fraudulent for 40 years. What changed? Theodore had been dreading this question, but he knew he owed her an honest answer. I've been staying with my nephew, Kevin. You remember him, Sarah's boy? He's an artist now, lives above a deli on 5th Street. And watching him struggle to make ends meet while still maintaining his integrity made me realize that I've been living without integrity for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Kevin asked me who I was without the title and the corner office and the fake reputation, and I realized I had no idea. For 40 years, I've been playing a character based on your work, your intelligence, your success. I want to find out who Theodore Harrington actually is when he's not stealing credit from his wife. Ex-wife, Beatrice corrected automatically. Ex-wife, Theodore acknowledged. But Beatrice, I need you to know that I'm not doing this to try to win you back. I'm not doing this because I think it will somehow undo the damage I caused. I'm doing this because living with the truth of what I've done is destroying me, and I can't carry this lie anymore. Beatrice picked up the handwritten confession and began reading through it, her expression unreadable. Theodore watched her eyes move across the pages, occasionally pausing to consider a particular passage. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Finally, she looked up. This is quite comprehensive. You've even included the Morrison account restructuring from 2019. I remembered how proud I was when the Financial Journal wrote that article, calling it a masterpiece of strategic thinking. Then I found your original proposal in the files, complete with your handwritten notes about Morrison's debt-to-equity ratios. I'd presented your work word for word and never even acknowledged that you'd done the analysis. Theodore, if you publish this confession, it won't just damage your reputation. It will call into question every deal Sterling Industries has ever done. Clients might lose confidence. Competitors might sense weakness. You could be damaging the company that you claim to want to protect. Theodore had considered this possibility during his weeks of research and soul-searching. That's why I'm bringing it to you first. You're the CEO now, the real CEO, not the pretend one I played for 40 years. This decision should be yours. If you think publishing the truth would harm Sterling Industries, then I won't do it. But if you think the company is strong enough to survive the revelation that it was built by Beatrice Harrington rather than Theodore Harrington, then maybe it's time for the world to know who really deserves the credit. Beatrice set the confession down and studied Theodore's face with the same intensity she'd once brought to analyzing financial statements. What do you get out of this, Theodore? Destroying your own reputation doesn't seem like a path to redemption. Maybe redemption isn't about getting something back, Theodore replied. Maybe it's about giving up something you never deserved in the first place. For the first time since entering the room, Beatrice's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness exactly, but something that might have been recognition that the man sitting across from her was finally telling her the truth. The phone call came at 11:30 that night, jarring Theodore from the first peaceful sleep he'd managed in weeks. Kevin's apartment was dark except for the glow of streetlights filtering through the thin curtains, and for a moment, Theodore was disoriented, unsure where he was or why his nephew was shaking his shoulder. Uncle Ted, you need to take this call. It's important. Theodore sat up on the couch, his back aching from another night on Kevin's secondhand furniture, and accepted the phone with a growing sense of dread. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was all too familiar. Theodore, darling, thank God I finally reached you. Amber's voice was breathless with panic, higher pitched than he remembered. Something terrible has happened. I need your help. Theodore rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep and figure out why Amber Sinclair was calling him at nearly midnight. They hadn't spoken since the day of his corporate downfall, when she'd left the boardroom looking shell-shocked and defeated. He'd assumed she was trying to salvage her own career at Sterling Industries, keeping as much distance as possible from his radioactive reputation. "Amber, it's late." "What's wrong?" "It's my apartment, the one on Riverside Drive. The company terminated the lease and I can't afford the rent on my own. I've been staying at my sister's place, but she's getting married next month and needs me to move out. I don't know what to do." Theodore's heart sank as the implications became clear. The apartment had been their secret sanctuary, the place where they'd played house and dreamed about their future together. Of course, Beatrice had terminated the lease. It was company property that had been misused for personal purposes. But Amber's housing crisis was his responsibility, a consequence of choices he'd made that had dragged her into a situation she'd never fully understood. "Amber, I'm sorry, but I'm not in a position to help right now. I'm staying on my nephew's couch. I don't even have my own place anymore." "But you have to have savings, investments, something. Theodore, I gave up my previous job to work for you. I turned down other opportunities because I thought we had a future together. You can't just abandon me now." The desperation in her voice was palpable, and Theodore felt the familiar tug of guilt that had been his constant companion for weeks. But underneath the guilt was something else, a growing realization that Amber's crisis was exposing the same pattern of thinking that had destroyed his marriage. "Amber, what exactly are you asking me to do?" "I found an apartment in Riverside Heights. It's smaller than the company place, but it's nice. The deposit is $5,000, and the monthly rent is $1,800. If you could just help me get started, I could pay you back once I get settled in my new position." Theodore was quiet for a moment, processing what she was really asking. $5,000 for a deposit, plus first month's rent, plus whatever moving expenses she might have. It wasn't an enormous sum by the standards of his former lifestyle, but given his current circumstances, it might as well have been $1 million. "Amber, I don't have that kind of money readily available. My assets are all tied up in legal proceedings related to the divorce." "But you have credit cards, don't you? Or you could borrow against your stock in Sterling Industries." There it was, the assumption that had gotten them both into this mess. Amber still believed that Theodore Harrington was a wealthy, powerful man who could solve problems with his checkbook. She still didn't understand that his apparent wealth had always been an illusion maintained by Beatrice's financial management. "Amber, I need you to understand something. I don't actually have any significant assets. The house, the cars, the investment accounts, all of that belong to Beatrice. My ownership stake in Sterling Industries is 15% of a company that I never actually controlled, and any dividends from that will be tied up in divorce proceedings for months." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Theodore wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Amber finally spoke, her voice carried a note of disbelief that he recognized from his own recent journey of self-discovery. "That's impossible. You were the CEO. You had expense accounts, company cars, that corner office. You were important." "I was an employee, Amber. A well-paid employee with a fancy title, but still just an employee. Everything you saw, the lifestyle, the apparent wealth, the power, it was all provided by Beatrice's company." Theodore could hear Amber's breathing become more rapid, the sound of someone whose entire understanding of reality was crumbling in real time. He recognized the feeling intimately. "But the apartment, the dinners, the trips we took, were all paid for with company money that Beatrice controlled. Money that I had no right to spend on personal expenses." Theodore's voice grew heavier as the full weight of his betrayal settled over him again. "Amber, I'm going to tell you something that I should have realized months ago. I was stealing from my own wife to fund our relationship." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Theodore had understood intellectually that he'd misused company resources, but saying it out loud, acknowledging that he'd been a thief as well as an adulterer, made the moral dimensions of his actions inescapable. "Theodore, you're scaring me. If you don't have money, if you can't help me, what am I supposed to do?" "You're supposed to do what I should have been doing all along, take responsibility for your own choices, and figure out how to move forward without depending on someone else's resources." The harshness of his own words surprised Theodore, but he realized they were true. Amber had made a calculated decision to align herself with someone she believed was wealthy and powerful. Now that the illusion had been shattered, she was expecting him to maintain the fantasy by continuing to provide for her, even though he no longer had the means to do so. "I can't believe you're being this cruel," Amber said, her voice breaking. "After everything we meant to each other, after all the promises you made about our future together." "What promises, Amber? Really think about it. What specific promises did I make?" Theodore waited while she struggled to answer, knowing that she would come up empty. He had been careful never to make explicit commitments about marriage or a shared future, always speaking in vague terms about when things settled down or once the timing was right. He'd enjoyed the fantasy of their relationship without ever taking concrete steps to make it real. "You said you loved me," she finally whispered. "I did love you. Or at least, I loved the way you made me feel. But I was living in a fantasy, Amber, and I dragged you into that fantasy with me. The man you fell in love with, the powerful CEO who could provide for you and give you the lifestyle you wanted, that man never existed." Kevin appeared in the doorway of his bedroom, clearly awakened by the sound of Theodore's voice. He stood there in his paint-splattered pajamas, watching his uncle with the kind of concerned attention that suggested he was witnessing something significant. "Theodore, please, I'm not asking for a fortune, just enough to get back on my feet. I thought you cared about me." "I did care about you, Amber, but caring about someone doesn't mean taking responsibility for their choices. You chose to get involved with a married man. You chose to accept gifts and privileges that weren't legitimately mine to give. Those choices have consequences, and those consequences aren't my responsibility to fix." The words were coming from some new part of Theodore's personality, a part that had been developing during his weeks of enforced self-reflection. For the first time in decades, he was refusing to solve a problem by throwing money at it, partly because he didn't have money to throw, but mostly because he was beginning to understand that money had never actually solved anything. "So that's it?" Amber's voice was thick with tears and anger. "You're just going to abandon me?" "I'm not abandoning you, Amber. I'm stopping the pattern of fake rescues that I've been using to avoid real responsibility my entire adult life. You're 28 years old, you have a college degree, and you're intelligent enough to figure out your own housing situation. You don't need me to solve your problems. You need to solve them yourself." After ending the call, Theodore sat in the darkness of Kevin's living room, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, the uncomfortable but oddly liberating sensation of refusing to be someone's financial solution. For 40 years, he'd used Beatrice's money to smooth over problems, to make people like him, to maintain the illusion of power and competence. Tonight, for the first time, he'd admitted that he had nothing to offer except the truth. Kevin sat down in the armchair across from the couch. "That sounded hard." "It was," Theodore admitted, "but it was also the first honest conversation I've had with Amber since I met her. Maybe the first honest conversation I've had with anyone in years. Do you think she'll be okay?" Theodore considered the question seriously. "I think she'll be better than okay. She's young, smart, and now she knows not to depend on men who promise more than they can deliver. That's a valuable lesson, even if it's a painful one." As he settled back onto the couch, Theodore realized that something fundamental had shifted in him. The old Theodore would have found a way to give Amber the money she needed, even if it meant borrowing against assets he didn't truly own, or manipulating Beatrice into providing funds for his mistress's housing. But the person he was becoming, the person he might have been all along if he'd had the courage to face reality, understood that true kindness sometimes meant refusing to enable other people's illusions. For the first time since his world had collapsed, Theodore fell asleep, feeling like he might actually be worthy of the redemption he was seeking. The envelope arrived at Theodore's nephew's apartment on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail with Beatrice's law firm letterhead embossed in dark blue ink. Kevin signed for it while Theodore was at the unemployment office, a humbling weekly ritual that had become part of his new reality, and left it propped against the coffee pot where Theodore would be sure to see it when he returned. Theodore stared at the envelope for a full 5 minutes before opening it, his mind racing through the possibilities. Divorce papers, probably, or perhaps a cease and desist order related to his proposed confession about Sterling Industries. He'd been waiting for weeks to hear Beatrice's decision about whether she would allow him to publish his admission of intellectual theft, and the official nature of this delivery suggested that her answer might not be what he'd hoped for. But when he finally tore open the envelope, the contents were far more complex than he'd anticipated. The first document was indeed related to the divorce, a comprehensive financial settlement that left Theodore speechless with its unexpected generosity. Rather than the punitive terms he'd expected, Beatrice was offering him a lump sum payment of $2 million, plus continued health insurance coverage and the deed to a modest townhouse in Riverside Heights. The second document was a letter, written in Beatrice's precise handwriting on her personal stationery. "Theodore," it began, "I've spent considerable time reviewing your confession and evaluating your proposal to publish it. After consultation with Sterling Industries' board of directors and our legal team, I've decided that the company's interests would be better served by a different approach to setting the record straight about our professional relationship. Rather than having you destroy what remains of your reputation through a public confession, I've decided to write my own account of Sterling Industries' history for publication in the Harvard Business Review. The article will be titled The Invisible Architect: 4 Decades of Building from Behind the Scenes, and will provide a complete and accurate record of how our company was actually built. This approach serves several purposes. It gives credit where credit is due without appearing vindictive toward you. It provides a case study for other women who might be working in similar shadow roles. And it protects Sterling Industries from the market uncertainty that might result from your more dramatic confession. As for the financial settlement outlined in the accompanying documents, please don't interpret this as charity or an attempt to assuage guilt. You are entitled to compensation for 40 years of work, even if that work was not what either of us believed it to be at the time. More importantly, I don't want my decision to finally claim credit for my contributions to be tainted by the knowledge that I left you destitute in the process. There is, however, one condition attached to this settlement. I need to know that the man who signs these papers is genuinely committed to the kind of honesty and self-reflection you demonstrated in our recent meeting, not simply trying to negotiate his way back into my good graces or financial security. To that end, I'm asking you to meet me at Riverside Park on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. There's something I need to show you before we finalize any legal arrangements. Regards, Beatrice." Theodore read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and implication. The financial settlement was more generous than he'd dared hope for, but it was Beatrice's decision to write her own article that truly stunned him. She wasn't going to let him fall on his sword in some grand gesture of public self-destruction. Instead, she was going to tell the true story herself, claiming her rightful place in the narrative, while maintaining enough dignity to protect both Sterling Industries and whatever remained of Theodore's reputation. But what did she need to show him at Riverside Park, and why was she making the settlement conditional on that meeting? Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made Crimson Falls look like a postcard. Theodore arrived at Riverside Park 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly from a habit of punctuality that dated back to his earliest days in business. He found Beatrice sitting on a bench overlooking the river, dressed casually in jeans and a wool sweater, an outfit he couldn't remember seeing her wear in years. "You're early," she said without looking up from the newspaper she was reading. "That's new. I've had a lot of time to work on my punctuality lately." Theodore sat down on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized all their recent interactions. "Thank you for the settlement offer. It's more generous than I deserve." "Deserve is a complicated word, Theodore. Let's talk about what you've actually earned instead." Beatrice folded the newspaper and turned to face him directly. "Do you know what this park means to me?" Theodore looked around at the familiar landscape, the walking paths he'd jogged on in his younger days, the playground where he'd pushed their daughter Sarah on swings during weekend visits, the gazebo where Crimson Falls held its summer concerts. It was a place full of family memories, though he realized he hadn't been here in years. "We used to bring Sarah here when she was little," he said tentatively. "We did, but that's not what I'm talking about." Beatrice pointed toward a small memorial garden that Theodore had never paid much attention to during their previous visits. "Do you see that bench over there? The one with the brass plaque?" Theodore squinted in the direction she was indicating and could just make out the gleam of metal on a bench about 50 yards away. "I see it, but I can't read the inscription from here. It's a memorial bench for my father, Harrison Cross. I had it installed 3 years ago, on the 5th anniversary of his death." Beatrice's voice carried a note of sadness that Theodore hadn't heard since the early days of their marriage. "I came here every Sunday morning for 2 years after he died, just to sit by that bench and think about the lessons he'd taught me." Theodore felt a stab of guilt as he realized that he had no memory of Beatrice grieving her father's death in any systematic way. He'd been to the funeral, of course, and had said all the appropriate things about Harrison Cross's legacy, but he'd never paid attention to how deeply his wife was affected by the loss. "I never knew you came here regularly," he admitted. "You never asked, but that's not why I wanted you to see this." Beatrice stood up and began walking toward the memorial bench, gesturing for Theodore to follow. "I want you to understand what my father taught me about money, power, and responsibility." As they approached the bench, Theodore could read the brass plaque. "Harrison Cross, 1925 to 2018. True wealth lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you build for others." Below the inscription was a smaller line, dedicated by his daughter, who learned that the most important gifts are given in silence. "My father built his textile empire from nothing, but he never forgot that his success depended on the work of thousands of other people," Beatrice said, running her fingers along the edge of the plaque. "He taught me that real power comes from lifting others up, not from taking credit for their contributions." Theodore was beginning to understand why Beatrice had brought him here. "You're saying that I did the opposite, that I built my reputation by diminishing yours." "I'm saying that you forgot a fundamental truth about leadership. The leader's job is to make other people successful, not to make other people make you look successful." Beatrice sat down on the memorial bench and looked out at the river. "For 40 years, I made you look successful. And for 40 years, you let everyone believe that was how it was supposed to work." "But you never corrected that impression," Theodore said, sitting down beside her. "You had opportunities to set the record straight, to claim credit for your work. Why didn't you?" Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. "Because I believed that our marriage was more important than my professional recognition. Because I thought that lifting you up was the same as building something together. Because I was raised to believe that good wives support their husbands' careers, even at the expense of their own. And now? Now I realize that supporting someone and enabling them are two different things. Supporting you would have meant helping you develop your own capabilities and encouraging you to acknowledge the contributions of others. Enabling you meant doing the work while letting you take the credit, which ultimately made you weaker, not stronger." Theodore felt the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "So when you gave me that confession to consider, you weren't really deciding whether to let me publish it. You were testing whether I understood the difference between supporting and enabling. I was testing whether you had learned to tell the truth about your own limitations, instead of expecting someone else to compensate for them." Beatrice turned to look at him directly. "The financial settlement I've offered isn't charity, Theodore. It's payment for 40 years of work that you actually did do, even if it wasn't the work you thought you were doing. What do you mean? You were an excellent spokesperson for Sterling Industries. You built genuine relationships with clients, you represented the company with dignity at industry events, and you provided a public face that people trusted and respected. Those are valuable skills, and they deserve compensation. What they don't deserve is the credit for building the company or making the strategic decisions that drove our success. Theodore nodded slowly, finally understanding the distinction Beatrice was making. You're saying I was a good employee, but not the visionary leader everyone believed me to be. I'm saying you were exactly what Sterling Industries needed you to be, as long as you had someone else handling the parts of the job you weren't equipped for. The problem wasn't your limitations, Theodore. The problem was your refusal to acknowledge them. As they sat together on the bench dedicated to Harrison Cross, watching the river flow toward the city skyline in the distance, Theodore realized that Beatrice was offering him something more valuable than money or forgiveness. She was offering him the truth about his own worth. Not the inflated version that had fed his ego for decades, but the real, honest assessment of what he had actually contributed to their shared enterprise. Will you accept the settlement? Beatrice asked. Only if you're certain that I've earned it through the work I actually did, not as compensation for the work I falsely claimed credit for. You've earned it, Theodore. You just finally understand what you earned it for. For the first time in months, Theodore felt like he knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. It was a smaller, more humble identity than the one he'd constructed over 4 decades. But it was real, and that, he was learning, made all the difference. 6 months later, Theodore stood in the modest kitchen of his new townhouse in Riverside Heights, reading Beatrice's Harvard Business Review article on his tablet while his morning coffee grew cold. The Invisible Architect, 4 decades of building from behind the scenes, had been published the previous week, and the response had been extraordinary. Business schools were already incorporating it into their curricula as a case study in gender dynamics and corporate leadership. Women's professional organizations had invited Beatrice to speak at conferences across the country. Most importantly, the article had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. It told the complete truth about Sterling Industries' success while maintaining enough dignity that Theodore could rebuild his life without being destroyed by shame. The article was masterfully written, presenting the complex reality of their professional relationship without demonizing Theodore or portraying herself as a victim. Instead, Beatrice had framed their story as an examination of how unconscious biases and traditional gender roles could create professional blind spots that damaged both parties involved. She'd given Theodore credit for his genuine contributions while making it clear that the strategic vision behind Sterling Industries had always been hers. But it was the final paragraph that had kept Theodore awake for the past 3 nights. The most profound lesson of this experience is that true partnership requires both parties to see each other clearly. For 40 years, I enabled my husband's illusions about his capabilities while suppressing my own need for recognition. He, in turn, accepted credit that wasn't his, while failing to appreciate the real source of our success. We both participated in a fiction that ultimately served neither of us well. The question that remains is whether it's possible for 2 people who have lived with such fundamental misunderstandings to find a way forward based on truth rather than convenience. Theodore had read that paragraph dozens of times, analyzing every word choice and implication. Was Beatrice suggesting that they might find a way back to each other? Or was she simply offering philosophical closure on their failed marriage? The ambiguity was driving him to distraction, especially since they hadn't spoken directly since the day at Riverside Park when he'd signed the settlement papers. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed Kevin's number, which was unusual since his nephew typically worked mornings at the coffee shop and rarely called before noon. "Uncle Ted, you need to get down to the Crimson Falls Community Center right away. There's something happening that you need to see." "Kevin, what are you talking about? I have a job interview this afternoon, and I need to prepare." "Trust me on this one. Cancel the interview if you have to." This is more important. The urgency in Kevin's voice was unsettling, but Theodore had learned to trust his nephew's judgment over the past few months. Kevin had been the one person who'd consistently told him the truth during his darkest period, and that honesty had proven invaluable as Theodore worked to rebuild his sense of self. 20 minutes later, Theodore pulled into the parking lot of the community center to find it unusually crowded for a Wednesday morning. Cars filled every space, and people were streaming toward the main entrance with an energy that suggested something significant was happening inside. Theodore spotted Kevin near the front door, gesticulating excitedly as he spoke with a group of people Theodore didn't recognize. "Kevin, what is all this?" "It's Aunt Bee's workshop," Kevin replied, barely able to contain his excitement. "She's been running a monthly seminar for women entrepreneurs, teaching them about business financing and strategic planning. But today is special. She's doing a presentation about partnership dynamics in business relationships, and she specifically asked me to make sure you were here." Theodore felt his stomach drop. "She asked you to bring me here? Why didn't she just call me directly?" "Because she wanted to make sure you came for the right reasons, not because you felt obligated or because you thought she was giving you some kind of signal about your relationship." Before Theodore could process the implications of Kevin's statement, a familiar voice came over the community center's PA system, asking everyone to take their seats for the beginning of the workshop. Theodore followed Kevin into the main hall, a large multi-purpose room that had been arranged with about 80 folding chairs facing a simple podium and projection screen. Beatrice stood at the front of the room, wearing a navy blue blazer and speaking with the kind of confident authority that had always been her hallmark in professional settings. But there was something different about her presence now, a freedom and authenticity that Theodore hadn't seen during their Sterling Industries years. She was finally occupying her rightful space as the expert and leader she'd always been, and the transformation was remarkable. "Today I want to talk about a subject that's been central to my own professional journey," Beatrice began, her voice carrying clearly through the room without amplification. "How do we build authentic partnerships when the people involved have fundamentally different understandings of their roles and contributions?" Theodore felt a chill of recognition as he realized that he was about to hear Beatrice's public analysis of their marriage and professional relationship. But instead of feeling exposed or defensive, he found himself genuinely curious about her perspective. "Partnership is not the same as division of labor," Beatrice continued, clicking to a slide that showed 2 overlapping circles. "True partnership requires that both parties understand not just what they're contributing, but what their partner is contributing as well. When that understanding breaks down, one person inevitably ends up carrying a disproportionate share of the load, while the other takes credit for the combined results." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "But what if the person taking credit genuinely doesn't realize they're doing it? What if they've convinced themselves that their contributions are more significant than they actually are?" Beatrice smiled. Not the polite professional smile Theodore remembered from corporate events, but something warmer and more genuine. "That's an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of why these situations are so difficult to resolve. When someone has built their identity around a false understanding of their own capabilities, confronting that reality becomes a matter of psychological survival, not just professional clarification." Theodore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing himself in Beatrice's description with painful clarity. "The person who's been doing the invisible work faces an equally difficult challenge," Beatrice continued. "They have to decide whether to continue enabling the other person's illusions or to risk destroying the relationship by insisting on truth and recognition." Another participant, a woman who looked to be about Theodore's age, spoke up without raising her hand. "What if you've been enabling someone for so long that you're not sure you remember how to stop? What if confronting the truth means admitting that you've wasted decades of your life?" The room fell silent, and Theodore could see that this question had struck a nerve with many of the women present. Several were nodding, and a few were wiping their eyes discreetly. "I don't think it's possible to waste decades of your life," Beatrice replied gently. "But it is possible to spend decades learning the wrong lessons from your experiences. The question isn't whether you've wasted time. It's whether you're willing to use what you've learned to make different choices going forward." She clicked to a new slide that showed a simple equation: truth plus humility equals possibility. Real partnership becomes possible when both parties are willing to see themselves and each other clearly. That requires the person who's been taking credit to acknowledge their limitations with genuine humility. And it requires the person who's been invisible to step into their power without apology or resentment. Theodore found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in Beatrice's presentation. She was describing a kind of relationship he'd never experienced, but suddenly desperately wanted. "But here's the crucial part," Beatrice said, looking directly at Theodore for the first time since he'd entered the room. "That transformation has to happen independently for each person. You can't change someone else, and you can't wait for someone else to change before you start living authentically. The only person you can control is yourself." A younger woman near the back of the room raised her hand. "So what do you do if you've done the work to see the situation clearly, but your partner is still living in the old illusions?" "You live your truth regardless," Beatrice replied without hesitation. "You stop enabling behaviors that don't serve either of you. You claim credit for your contributions. You set boundaries that protect your energy and integrity. And then you let the other person decide whether they want to join you in reality or continue living in fantasy." Theodore felt something shift inside him as he understood what Beatrice was really saying. This entire workshop, this public examination of partnership dynamics, was her way of laying out the terms for any future relationship between them. She wasn't asking him to change or promising to take him back. She was simply explaining what authentic partnership would require, and leaving him to decide whether he was capable of meeting those requirements. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in his adult life, Theodore was being offered a relationship based on complete honesty rather than comfortable illusions. The question was whether he had the courage to accept it. The workshop ended with a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Theodore remained in his seat as the audience filed out, watching Beatrice accept congratulations and business cards from dozens of women who clearly saw her as both inspiration and mentor. She moved through the crowd with the kind of natural authority that he now recognized had always been there, simply hidden beneath decades of deliberate self-diminishment. When the last participant had left, only Theodore, Beatrice, and Kevin remained in the community center's main hall. Kevin was packing up the audiovisual equipment with the efficient competence he brought to everything, while Beatrice organized her presentation materials at the podium. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that remained unspoken. "That was extraordinary," Theodore said finally, his voice carrying across the empty room. "Not just the presentation, but watching you in your element. I don't think I've ever seen you so completely yourself." Beatrice looked up from her papers, studying his face with the kind of careful attention she'd once brought to analyzing financial statements. "And what do you think of the person you're seeing?" "I think she's remarkable. I think she's brilliant and strong and absolutely formidable. And I think I spent 40 years being too intimidated by her capabilities to acknowledge them properly." "Intimidated?" Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting word choice." Theodore stood up slowly, his back aching from the uncomfortable folding chair, and walked toward the front of the room. "I've been thinking about this for months, ever since that day at Riverside Park. I used to tell myself that I took credit for your work because I was arrogant or selfish or just oblivious. But the truth is more complicated than that." He stopped about 10 feet away from the podium, close enough to have a normal conversation but far enough away to avoid crowding her space. "I was afraid that if people knew how brilliant you were, they'd realize how ordinary I was by comparison. So I built my entire identity around your intelligence, while simultaneously diminishing your contributions so that my own limitations wouldn't be so obvious." Beatrice finished organizing her papers and gave him her full attention. "Go on." "The affair with Amber wasn't really about her, and it wasn't really about being unhappy with our marriage. It was about finding someone who saw me the way I wanted to see myself. As powerful, decisive, successful. Someone who didn't know that every impressive thing about Theodore Harrington had actually originated from Beatrice Harrington's mind. Kevin paused in his equipment packing, clearly recognizing the significance of what was happening, but unsure whether he should leave them alone. Beatrice caught his eye and nodded toward the door. "Kevin, thank you for your help today. Could you give us a few minutes?" After Kevin left, closing the door behind him with careful quiet, Beatrice walked down from the podium and took a seat in one of the front row chairs. "So what you're telling me is that you betrayed our marriage because you were insecure about your own intelligence?" "I'm telling you that I betrayed our marriage because I was too cowardly to face the truth about my own limitations. I'd rather destroy what we had than admit that I needed you more than you needed me." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And now? Have you figured out how to face those limitations?" Theodore laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've spent the past 6 months discovering exactly how limited I actually am. I've been working as a customer service representative for a software company, answering phone calls from people who can't figure out how to reset their passwords. My supervisor is 26 years old and has to explain basic computer functions to me on a regular basis. That must be humbling." "It's been the most educational experience of my adult life," Theodore replied seriously. "For the first time ever, I have a job where success depends entirely on my own capabilities. No one is covering for my weaknesses or compensating for my blind spots. I'm succeeding or failing based purely on what I can actually do." "And how are you doing?" "Better than I expected, actually. It turns out that 40 years of client interaction gave me some genuinely useful skills. I'm good at staying calm when people are frustrated. I can explain complex issues in simple terms. And I actually enjoy helping people solve problems. Not glamorous work, but honest work." Beatrice smiled slightly. "You sound surprised to discover that you have real capabilities." "I am surprised. I'd gotten so used to depending on your abilities that I'd forgotten I had any of my own." Theodore sat down in the chair next to hers, close enough to continue their conversation without the formality of distance. "But that's not why I wanted to talk to you today." "What did you want to talk about?" Theodore took a deep breath, knowing that everything depended on his next words. "I wanted to tell you that I understand what you were offering in that workshop. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but the possibility of authentic partnership if I could prove that I'm capable of living in reality instead of comfortable illusions. And I want you to know that I'm not ready for that yet." Beatrice blinked in surprise. Of all the things she might have expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. "I've spent 6 months learning how to be honest about my limitations," Theodore continued, "but I haven't spent enough time developing my actual strengths. I can see the difference between who I pretended to be and who I actually am, but I'm not sure yet who I could become." He turned to face her directly. "You deserve a partner who brings equal value to the relationship, not someone who's still figuring out what value he has to offer. I don't want to repeat the old pattern where you carry the load while I take credit. But I also don't want to create a new pattern where I'm so grateful for your competence that I diminish myself all over again." Beatrice studied his face with renewed interest. "So what are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we spend the next year learning how to be genuinely independent people. You continue building your consulting practice and speaking career. I continue figuring out what Theodore Harrington is actually good at when he's not living off someone else's success. And maybe, at the end of that year, we'll both be ready for the kind of partnership you described in your workshop." "A partnership between equals," Beatrice said slowly. "A partnership between two people who know their own worth and can appreciate each other's contributions without competition or resentment." Theodore smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "I love you, Beatrice. I've always loved you. But I think I need to learn how to love myself honestly before I can love you authentically." Beatrice was quiet for a long time, processing his proposal with the same careful analysis she brought to all important decisions. Finally, she reached over and took his hand, not romantically, but with the warmth of genuine affection. "I think that might be the wisest thing you've ever said to me." "Does that mean you'll consider it? The year of independence, I mean?" "I think it means I'm willing to find out who we both become when we're not trying to be someone else's solution." Beatrice squeezed his hand gently, then released it. "But, Theodore, I need you to understand something. This isn't a guarantee. A year from now, we might discover that we've grown in directions that don't include each other." "I understand. And I'm willing to take that risk because the alternative, trying to rebuild our relationship on the same foundation that failed before, isn't really an option anymore." As they sat together in the empty community center, surrounded by the folding chairs that had held an audience of women learning to claim their own power, Theodore realized that this felt like the most honest conversation of his entire adult life. No promises, no guarantees, no comfortable illusions about easy reconciliation. Just two people who had finally learned to see each other clearly, deciding whether they wanted to find out what they could build together based on truth rather than convenience. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning that reminded them both of the day they'd sat on Harrison Cross's memorial bench, Theodore and Beatrice met for coffee at a small cafe near the Crimson Falls Community Center. They had stories to tell each other about the people they'd become during their year of independence, and for the first time in 41 years, both of them were genuinely curious to hear what the other had learned about themselves. The conversation that followed would determine whether their story ended with wisdom gained through loss, or began again with the kind of partnership that only becomes possible when two people finally know who they really are. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.